The crash came at 2:13 in the morning, loud enough to rattle the framed photographs in the hallway and send a glass of water spilling from Nora Whitaker's bedside table. She woke with a gasp, heart hammering, certain for one confused second that someone had thrown a stone through the house. Beside her, her husband Martin was already sitting up. At 66, he moved slower than he once had, but fear still made him fast. He grabbed the lamp cord, flooding the bedroom in a weak yellow glow, and listened. The old farmhouse held its breath around them. No second crash, no footsteps, no voices outside. Just the ticking wall clock, the faint groan of November wind against the siding, and then from somewhere below the bedroom window, a low scraping sound. "Did you hear that?" Nora whispered. Martin nodded once and swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Stay here." "I'm not staying here." They had lived alone too long for either of them to bother pretending otherwise. The Whitakers' house sat at the edge of a broad Kansas field, half a mile from the nearest road and farther than that from their nearest neighbor. At night, the place was all darkness and weather. If something hit the house that hard, there was no one else to investigate. Martin pulled on his robe and slippers, took the flashlight from the dresser drawer, and led the way downstairs. Nora followed in her cardigan with one hand gripping the banister and the other pressed against her chest. The sound had come from the back of the house near the kitchen windows that looked out over the vegetable patch in the old tool shed. Martin unlatched the mudroom door, shone the flashlight across the porch, and exhaled. "It's a bird." Nora stepped beside him. On the wooden boards crumpled beneath the window lay a large owl. Even half stunned and hunched against the cold, it looked magnificent. Mottled brown and gray feathers, broad wings partly spread, dark eyes open but unfocused. One talon flexed weakly against the porch plank. It must have struck the glass at full speed while hunting over the yard. "Oh, the poor thing," Nora said softly. Martin crouched but kept a careful distance. "Don't touch it yet. It could still claw." They had both grown up on farms. They knew enough about injured wildlife to respect it. The owl's beak was hooked and sharp, its feet built for killing field mice in an instant. But as Martin angled the flashlight lower, something caught his eye near the bird's right side. A strip of dark material protruded from under one wing. At first he thought it was a torn feather shaft, or maybe a weed stem from the garden. Then the owl shifted, and the strip moved. "Cloth." "No," Martin murmured. "What is it?" He leaned closer. "There's something under its wing." Nora fetched the old wool blanket they kept on a peg in the mudroom for cold evenings and placed it in Martin's hands. Very gently, he tossed part of it over the owl's head and shoulders, enough to calm it and protect them both. The bird struggled once, weakly, then grew still. "Flashlight," Martin said. Nora held the beam steady while he carefully lifted the edge of the wing. What they found there made both of them go silent. Tucked tight against the owl's body by a loop of thin twine was a tiny oilskin packet, no bigger than a man's wallet. It had been wrapped in dark cloth and tied beneath the wing with surprising care, as if someone had fastened it there on purpose. Nora stared. "What on earth?" Martin looked down at the owl, then at the packet, then back at the kitchen window where it had hit. That didn't happen by accident. The owl gave a faint, raspy hiss from beneath the blanket. For a moment, the cold porch, the wind, the dark fields beyond the yard all seemed to press closer. Nora lowered her voice instinctively. Who would tie something to an owl? Martin didn't answer, because he was wondering something worse. Not who would, who still did. Their farmhouse was old enough to have history layered through it like dust in the attic beams. Built by Martin's grandfather, added onto twice, and never far from family stories, it had outlasted drought, war, foreclosure scares, and one tornado that took the barn roof but left the house untouched. Some of the stories Nora loved. Others she found unsettling. One of the unsettling ones involved Martin's great-uncle Elias. Elias Whitaker had lived in the house during the winter of 1944, while Martin's grandfather was overseas. He had been an odd private man even before the war, and stranger after. He kept pigeons for a time, then crows, then, according to Martin's late mother, tried his hand with things that should have been left wild. There had been rumors in town that Elias sometimes sent messages across the county by birds when fuel was rationed and roads were watched. Most people dismiss those tales as family embellishment, until now. Martin carefully snipped the twine with his pocket knife and slipped the little packet free. The owl twitched, but did not resist. Inside the house, under the kitchen light, Nora spread a dish towel on the table, while Martin laid the packet on top of it. The cloth was damp but intact. He untied the cord slowly, exposing a second wrapping inside. Waxed paper, yellow with age. Nora swallowed. Martin. He opened it. Inside was a folded note, a brass key gone green with tarnish, and a small black and white photograph. The photograph showed three men standing beside a truck in front of what looked like a grain elevator. One of the men was unmistakably Elias Whitaker in his younger days. Lean, severe, hat pulled low. Another wore a sheriff's badge. The third man held a wooden crate with air holes punched into the sides. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "If this reaches home, open the west wall before winter." For a long time, neither Martin nor Nora spoke. Then Nora looked up slowly. Home. Martin stared at the photo as if it might rearrange itself into something sensible. This is home. The note, when unfolded, was even stranger. It was written in a cramped hand that looked like Elias's from old account books still stored in the attic. Much of the ink had faded, but enough remained to read. If the birds still fly the old route, trust the one that comes at night. Do not burn the papers. They are hidden where the chimney shadow falls in October. Use the brass key. Tell Ruth I did not mean for it to end that way. Nora read it twice. What papers? Martin looked at the key. Old. Handmade. Not modern house hardware, but something for a chest or interior lock. Outside, the owl stirred faintly inside the blanket-lined box they had set near the stove to warm while they decided whether to call the wildlife center. Martin had brought it in after checking for obvious fractures. Stunned, yes. Bleeding, no. It needed a rehabilitator by morning, but for now the cold would kill it faster than the house would. Nora folded the note carefully. This is impossible. Martin gave a humorless little laugh. That's one word for it. The name Ruth hung in the air between them. Martin knew it at once. Ruth was Elias's sister, Martin's aunt, dead nearly 30 years. She had never married and had lived in the farmhouse until the end of her life, sleeping in the room that later became the sewing room Nora used for quilts. Ruth had been practical, private, and deeply unwilling to discuss her brother. If asked, she only ever said, Elias left a mess, and some of us had to live in it. Martin had always assumed she meant finances or family shame. Now he was no longer sure. Nora touched the edge of the note. What if he meant this house literally? The west wall. Martin looked toward the living room, where the old stone chimney rose through the center of the house, but cast long shadows over the west interior wall each autumn afternoon. They both turned at the same time. The wall in question was hidden behind a tall oak bookcase that had not been moved in at least 20 years. At 2:47 in the morning, with an injured owl in a box by the stove, and the strangest note either of them had ever seen on the kitchen table, Martin and Nora pushed the bookcase aside. Dust lifted in gray clouds. A dead pencil rolled from underneath. One shelf nearly spilled its contents before Nora caught a stack of seed catalogs. Behind the bookcase, the plaster looked ordinary at first, cracked in places, stained with age. But near the baseboard, where the chimney's angled shadow would indeed fall in late October, Martin found something that made his stomach tighten. A narrow brass plate set almost flush into the wall. Small, square, easy to miss. A keyhole. Nora looked at him. No. Martin held up the tarnished key. It fit. For 1 second he hesitated, hand trembling on the metal. Then he turned it. Somewhere inside the wall, an old mechanism clicked. A section of plaster, no wider than a cabinet door, shifted outward by half an inch. Nora stepped back so quickly she struck the table behind her. Martin pulled gently, and the hidden panel swung open on recessed hinges, releasing a breath of stale, trapped air into the room. Inside was a shallow cavity lined with cedar boards. And inside that cavity sat a tin document box, 3 cloth-wrapped bundles, and an old revolver in a leather holster gone stiff with age. Nora whispered, Martin. He lifted the tin box out first. The lid stuck but opened. Inside were letters, bank ledgers, newspaper clippings, and what looked like signed statements from at least 6 different farmers in the county dated between 1943 and 1945. Names Martin recognized. Families still living nearby. There were receipts for grain sales, notes about shipments, and one particularly chilling page listing quantities of fuel, seed, and medical supplies diverted from official channels during the war years. Black market records, not petty ones either. Worse still were the letters underneath. One, written by Ruth, accused Elias and the county sheriff in the photograph of using ration shortages to extort desperate families. Another hinted that a barn fire long blamed on faulty lanterns had been set deliberately to destroy evidence. A third letter, unsigned, suggested that one local man who threatened to speak disappeared after confronting them. Martin sat down hard in the nearest chair. "Dear God," Nora read over his shoulder, face draining of color. "Your uncle was involved in all this?" "It looks that way." The cloth bundles contained more of the same. Account books, keys to safe deposit boxes that were surely long closed, a silver badge not matching any current county issue, and a packet of photographs of grain stores, trucks, and men Martin had only ever heard named at funerals. At the very bottom of the cavity lay one final envelope, addressed simply, "For whoever still lives under this roof and wants the truth more than peace." Martin opened it with numb fingers. Inside was a confession of sorts. Elias wrote that he had hidden the papers after realizing the sheriff intended to destroy them, and perhaps him as well. He claimed he had gone along with the scheme at first, moving ration supplies, profiting from shortages, keeping quiet when good men were ruined, but had later tried to break from it when the barn business turned to murder. He wrote that he could not trust the mail, could not trust the roads, and could barely trust the men who still shook his hand in town. So he trained night birds to carry routes between isolated farms, hiding copies of the evidence in case anything happened to him. And then one final line, "If I do not return, it means the route failed, not the truth." Nora sat very still. Outside, the wind pressed once against the windows and moved on. "So the owl," she said at last. Martin looked toward the stove. The bird had struck the kitchen window because this had been the destination all along. Not tonight, perhaps. Not literally after 80 years with some deliberate human hand behind it. But the root, the instinct, the hidden training passed through generations of owls nesting in the old cupola of the Whitaker barn, perhaps, or the descendants of birds once handled and released from these fields. Maybe the packet had been lodged or preserved somewhere, and only now, torn loose from a rotted beam or attic nest, carried by chance or by a behavior too old to explain. Maybe an owl had discovered the cloth bundle in the barn loft, and following some dim territorial pattern, flown toward the lit kitchen window with it tucked in feathers and twine caught from nesting material. Or maybe, as Nora said in a voice half fearful and half reverent, "Some things wait until they're found." Martin was too tired and too shaken to argue. By dawn, they had called 2 people. First, the state wildlife rescue line for the owl. Second, Martin's niece Claire, a history teacher in Wichita who knew how to handle archives and difficult truths better than anyone in the family. The owl went first. A rehabilitator named Jenna arrived just after sunrise, took one look at the bird and the packet materials, and frowned. "Great horned owl. Mild concussion, I think. He's lucky the glass didn't break his neck." She checked the wings carefully, then paused. This twine under the feathers was woven into nesting material. Looks old in some places, newer in others. Strange. Martin and Nora exchanged a glance but said nothing yet. Claire arrived before noon, hair unbrushed, notebook in hand, skepticism all over her face. That lasted about 6 minutes. Then she was sitting at the kitchen table with the photo, the confession, and the hidden ledger books spread around her, saying, "You realize this could reopen half the accepted history of this county?" Martin rubbed both hands over his face. "That's what I was afraid of." Claire read the confession twice, then looked up. "And what do you want to do?" That question sat heavy in the room. Outside, the November sun dragged pale light over the fields. The house smelled of dust, coffee, and the faint wild musk the owl had left behind. Nora looked toward the hidden wall panel, still open in the living room. "For years," she said slowly, Your family kept peace by not talking about Elias. Your aunt kept peace by hiding what she knew. Maybe that made sense then. Maybe people were tired. Maybe they were scared. Claire nodded. But if innocent people were ruined, Nora continued, and if one of those fires wasn't an accident, then peace built on silence was never really peace. Martin stared at the old sheriff's face in the photograph. He thought of names in town, of stories old men told after funerals and never at any other time, of one widow long dead now who had always insisted her husband didn't disappear drunk no matter what the paper said, of the strange shame that had clung to Elias's memory without ever quite explaining itself. He let out a long breath. We tell the truth. It took months. Claire contacted a state archivist and a historian from the university. The county records office reluctantly opened old files. Newspaper clippings were cross-checked against ration reports, land transfers, insurance claims, and a suspicious cluster of debt foreclosures from 1944 and 1945. One by one, the shape of the scheme emerged. Elias Whitaker had indeed worked with Sheriff Hal Brenner and at least two others to divert wartime supplies, squeeze local farmers, and cover shortages through fraud and arson. Whether Elias had turned against them from conscience or fear remained unclear. But the records hidden in the wall were real, and so were the harms they documented. Families who had lived under quiet suspicion for generations were finally cleared in the public record. One long-dismissed death investigation was formally amended. A memorial plaque at the town hall was updated to include the name of a man previously omitted after false accusations of theft. And through all of it, people kept asking the same question once the newspaper story broke. How did the documents come to light? Martin always told that part exactly. An owl hit our window in the middle of the night, he said, and under its wing was the reason. Most people laughed first, then saw he was serious, then stopped laughing. Jenna, the rehabilitator, released the owl in early December. The bird had recovered fully and was returned to the Whitaker farm at Martin's request. Just before dusk, under a sky the color of dull steel, Jenna opened the carrier in the field behind the barn. The owl stood for one breathless second on the edge, fierce and silent. Then it opened its wings and rose cleanly into the cold air. Nora watched until it vanished over the western hedgerow. Do you think it knew? Martin slipped his hands into his coat pockets. Knew what? That it was carrying something that mattered. He considered the question longer than she expected. No, he said at last. Not like we mean it. Nora smiled faintly. Still, that was the word for it. Still, it had come. Still, it had struck the one window where someone would wake. Still, the key and the note and the truth had crossed 80 years to land in the kitchen of the only two people stubborn enough to follow them. Still, what had been hidden in fear came out because something wild crashed into glass on a wind-black night. The hidden wall was eventually sealed again, though not before Claire photographed every inch of it. The box and papers went to the county archive under careful legal agreement. The old revolver, thankfully, was too rusted to fire and became an exhibit rather than a threat. Elias Whitaker's name, once only muttered in family bitterness, became something harder and sadder. Not a villain simply, and not a hero, but a man who had done wrong, feared worse, and failed to stop it in time, except by leaving a trail for others. Martin could live with that version better than silence. Sometimes late at night when the kitchen lamp was the only light left in the house, Nora would glance at the window and think of feathers hitting glass, of hidden packets and secret walls, of how history waited in the strangest places for someone to finally look beneath the wing. And Martin, hearing owls call from the fields beyond the barn, no longer heard only wilderness. He heard an old route finishing itself.